Well, good evening. Well, all right, we will get started. Let's open in prayer. Father God, we want to give you thanks each and every time we gather together, each and every time we have an opportunity, Lord, to just declare your goodness, your greatness, your power, your glory, Lord God. It's perfect in every way. Your word has been presented to us, Lord God, written by you as an instruction for us to learn from and to grow in and to transform our minds and our thinking and our hearts, Lord God. I pray that once again, as we study your word, even in areas where it reveals the depths of the human wickedness and depravity that people fall into, that we would, in fact, Lord God, remind ourselves of how gracious and how loving and long-suffering you are towards us, Lord, and to recognize that you're always moving, always working, and always calling us to surrender our hearts to you, Lord God. So I pray that we would do that very thing as we learn and grow in your word tonight, once again, as we are led by your Spirit. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, we have a strategy and a plan we talked about last week, and that is to get through the final 5 chapters of the book of Judges tonight and then next week. Seems very, very doable, having put basically all of it together here. We're going to cover 3 chapters tonight. Which means there's going to be a lot, there's going to be some reading out of Scripture, meaning we're going to have to cover, I want to go verse by verse, don't want to skip any of the verses. The first chapter is fairly short, and then the next chapters are kind of average-ish, 30 verses or so each. And then we'll save a couple of chapters for next week. And let's kind of get in. This is, as we make this transition after Samson in chapter 16, looking at the final 5 chapters, we are looking at what we might call in a traditional book or movie or whatever. There's going to be an epilogue here, and it's somewhat like the author of Judges, or the Holy Spirit, who is the author of Judges, decided, look, there's information here that needs to be reported on to make some continuity connections between Moses and Joshua, and then what picks up in the book of Samuel, with Samuel the judge, of course Eli and Samuel, and then ultimately for Saul and David, and then moving into the time of Solomon and the rest of the kings in the books of Kings. And so there's some parts and pieces here that are very helpful for us to make that continuity bridge between those that wouldn't happen if we didn't look at these 5 chapters. And so, we should, in one sense, look at Samson's death that we recorded last time, the end of chapter 16. We should look at that, recognizing that Samson's death somewhat marks the end of the period of the Judges, at least in what's recorded in the book of Judges. Because in the book of 1 Samuel, it will identify Eli. You might recall him. Eli is, somewhat okay, except his sons were horrible. And of course, he instructs and kind of raises Samuel up from the time he was weaned there in the temple. And so, so Eli is called a judge also, just like Samson was. And so if Eli follows, then he would be another one in the continuing string of judges. And then finally, we would see Samuel himself as one who is referred to as judging Israel all the days of his life. Is referenced there in 1 Samuel 7:15. And that's as true as you could possibly imagine, because like I said, from the time he was weaned, he was basically stationed with the judge of Israel, and was starting to have even an influence and impact and a calling of God even at a very young age. Samson ends the book of Judges in terms of the named judges that we see in that period of time. But Samuel picks up with at least 2 additional judges who were incorporated into that succession of judges or series of judges until you get to the very first king who was appointed, or at least allowed to be king by God, King Saul. So anyway, just as a point, some points of reference there. So these final 5 chapters kind of serve as, like I said, an epilogue of additional people, additional events that help to characterize, really, I think part of this is to characterize the moral depravity of Israel during this period. So If you're coming tonight to expect to read really powerful, uplifting kind of information about how great Israel was or any the human race is in the world, we're not going to see it here. It's not that every single person that we talk about is awful, but most of them are corrupt. Most of them have turned completely away from following God, Yahweh, in any capacity whatsoever. And we'll see this pretty much right away, they continue to use his name. And that reminds me of like the golden calf incident where Moses is up on the mountain for 40 days and the people get a little nervous and they decide, hey, Aaron, why don't you make us an idol, throw some gold into the fire or, fashion us a golden calf. And he fashions them a golden calf and says, here's Yahweh. Not just here's a generic God or here's the God from Egypt, but here's Yahweh, your God who delivered you. And they're going to do the same thing here. They're going to use his name. Again, the 4 capital letters of Lord in your English translations serves as the name of Yahweh. And they're going to use his name many times. And very few times do we see it actually meaning something in terms of how they responded to it. So, okay, let's take a look here at chapter 17. We'll look at the first 6 verses and look at the section heading we're going to call Micah's idolatry. And so we'll jump into that. I will tell you now, it's in the notes, but I'll also tell you, this is not the Micah who's got a book named after him in the Minor Prophets. This is a different Micah, very much earlier in the history. So don't think, oh, Micah was an idolater. No, the Micah who wrote the book of in the Minor Prophets section of the Bible is not the same guy. All right, so with that, we'll look at Judges 17:1. Now there was a man from the mountains of Ephraim whose name was Micah. And he said to his mother, the 1,100 shekels of silver, he said to his mother, the 1,100 shekels of silver that were taken from you, and on which you put a curse, even in my ears. Is that right? Yeah, okay, sorry. I had it out of order in a second, so it's confusing me. The 1,100 shekels of silver that were taken from you, and on which you put a curse, saying it even in my ears, here is the silver with me, I took it. And his mother said, blessed be Yahweh, my son. So when he had returned the 1,100 shekels of silver to his mother said, I had wholly dedicated the silver from my hand to Yahweh for my son, to make a carved image and a molded image. Now, therefore, I will return it to you. Thus he returned the silver to his mother. Then his mother took 200 shekels of silver and gave them to the silversmith. And he made it into a carved image and a molded image, and they were in the house of Micah. Then Micah had a shrine and made an ephod and a household idols and consecrated one of his sons who became his priest. In those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Okay. So trying to unpack all this for you, again, I in my mind, I was going to tell a story that the scripture infers more than it tells here. So yeah, Micah's not the minor prophet, but his name means who is like Yahweh. So his parents, his mother, who's in the account here, gives him the name Micah, which means who is like Yahweh. And that's obviously a compliment. Like he's so much greater and more powerful and more the only God there is, that, who is like Yahweh, meaning there's no one who can compare to him. And yet their actions don't seem to align or conform with someone who would worship even the first and serve and be obedient to the first or second commandment of God, first, second, or third. So we see here in the story, you kind of have to piece it a little bit together from what he claims, but Micah had stolen 1,100 shekels of silver from his own mother. We don't know if they lived together. We don't know exactly the relationship and all that was going on there. So we don't really know who he was. Was he a teenager? Was he a 40-year-old man who stole from his 60-year-old mother? We don't know anything about that. We just know that his mother had a decent amount of silver in her house, and her son Micah, who either lived with her or didn't live with her, came and took that silver and used it for himself. And when she realizes that the silver has been stolen from her by whoever, we don't know if she actually knew it was Micah or not, but she audibly curses the stolen silver so that whoever used that money would be cursed in her name, in her mind anyway, by Yahweh. So she's got this silver. Someone's stolen it from her. So she, initiates or speaks a curse over the funds that were stolen so that whoever used it would be cursed because they had used her stolen money. At least that was her hope. I don't know if she actually has a relationship with Yahweh or Yahweh agreed to this curse, but anyway. Micah hears this, and maybe that was her intention. I want my son to hear that I put a curse on the money, and maybe she just was speaking loudly because she was upset. But she speaks a curse and decides, and having heard his mother speak the curse, Micah decides to return the stolen silver to her. He's hoping that the curse against him would be broken. Like, he doesn't want to be cursed. These are interesting mindsets, right? I'll go steal from people, but I don't want to be cursed. And so I'd rather return the money than be cursed. And so, it's an interesting level of mindset of where you draw your morality line, but that's where it was for him. He doesn't want to be cursed by his mother or by Yahweh. So he returns the stolen silver. And then, she's not angry or upset whatsoever with what's going on here. His mother was happy that the money had been returned, and she blesses her son, like trying to reverse the curse herself, for returning the silver. And then she even blesses her son, offers a blessing to him in Yahweh's name again. So he's a great attribute to add to your faith life, but they obviously have very little interest in being obedient to him, serving him, and exclusively keeping him as God and all of these other pagan constructions of what people were worshiping in their land away from them. Now, it's ironic to me on many levels that she intended to use some of this money that had been stolen for her to go and make a molded image for her son to worship. She curses in Yahweh's name, she blesses in Yahweh's name, and she decides she wants to give her son idols to worship, who Yahweh clearly has told Israel that is a violation of the commandments, and would be someone should be put to death if they violated those commandments. It's pretty serious stuff. But with her money restored, now, so all this, whatever this intrigue that was going on between mom and son, the son restores the money, the mom blesses her son, and then she takes 200 of the 1,100 shekels and takes it over to a silversmith, and she wants the silversmith to carve, one says carved and one says molded, so a couple of different idols crafted by a skilled idolatry craftsman, so that Micah could have it for himself to worship in his house. And that might indicate that they weren't living together, right? Mother and son under the same roof, but maybe when she says house, meaning in the place of where he resides more so than a different location. I don't know. Again, this is all just guessing as to what might be happening between mother and son here. So while Yahweh is referenced many times by Micah and his mother, as I'm kind of laying out for you here, you can see that virtually every action they took could easily be categorized as a sin against Yahweh and a violation of the law that he gave to his people. Can't just use his name and hope that it covers the multitude of all the other sins that we commit, right? And so that's what they seem to be doing, just incorporating false worship with the use of God's name, covenant name, his perfect name, Yahweh. All right, so with that scene a little slightly behind us, Micah then establishes these idols that were paid for by his mother and fashioned by the silversmith. He begins to establish a place of idolatrous worship, pagan worship, in his own house. So the text says he built a pagan shrine, that they should be worshiping Yahweh at the tabernacle that Moses and the children of Israel had in the wilderness. They should be going there. They should be bringing their offerings, the burnt sacrifices and the grain offerings and the bread offerings and the wine offerings and all these things. They could bring that to God there in the tabernacle, but instead he's building a pagan shrine in his own house. Like Gideon, he made an ephod, and I presume that so that ephod could be worn by a priest, which is first appointed by him to be his own son. And then he sets up these idols that his mom had given to him, through the silver. So he's got this, pagan worship, abomination in his house that he is all completely strategized to build up for himself. So, and then we see in verse 6, again, the new refrain that'll be repeated, I think, about 4 times here in the last 5 chapters, is that Israel, or what we should know about Israel during this season, is that there were, in those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Now, we're going to see here some strong references in the next section of chapter 17, that this story happens very early in the timeline of Judges. Okay, this is not at the end of the account of Judges, and oh, by the way, here's some additional stuff that how bad it got. Everything that we're looking at here, there's at least 2 different markers that seem to indicate this is very early in the time of the Judges, like right after Joshua's death would be a way of looking at it. So the chronicler, the narrator here is telling us in those days, meaning in the days of the Judges for about 400 years, there was no king in Israel, so everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. They weren't following Yahweh. They weren't listening. The judges weren't holding enough power over the people to change their moral condition or to encourage them to live for Yahweh alone. And so the thing that characterizes the book of Judges, not just the epilogue, not just the last 5 chapters, but the whole period of time, is that everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. Okay, so the same Micah that we just looked at here in the first 6 verses has another much longer encounter with another person here that we're going to see. And so Micah and the Levite, we pick up in chapter 17, verse 7. Now there was a young man from Bethlehem in Judah, of the family of Judah. He was a Levite, and he was staying there. The man departed from the city of Bethlehem in Judah to stay wherever he could find a place. Then he came to the mountains of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, as he journeyed. And Micah said to him, "Where do you come from?" And Micah said to him, Micah said to him, "Dwell with me, and be a father and a priest to me, and I will give you 10 shekels of silver per year, a suit of clothes, and your sustenance." So the Levite went in. Then the Levite was content to dwell with the man, and the young man became like one of his sons to him. So Micah consecrated the Levite, and the young man became his priest and lived in the house of Micah. Then Micah said, "Now I know that Yahweh will be good to me, since I have a Levite as a priest." Okay. All right, so Micah's not starting off too strongly here in all that he's doing. So this young man comes to Micah's house from Judah, but he's called a Levite. So this might be a little confusing. I'll explain a little bit of it here as we go. He's not, we wouldn't say, if he's a Levite, he's not from the tribe of Judah. He had been living in the territory, the region of the tribe of Judah, but a Levite descends from Levi, who is like, Aaron and Moses and the priestly tribe. So the Levites, if you recall from the days of Moses, the days of Joshua, and all that was recorded in those various accounts in Numbers and Deuteronomy and Joshua, the Levites were not given a territory of their own. They were only given cities within the territories of the other 11 or 12 tribes of Israel, so that they had places to live, but they didn't have territories that they lived from. So he says, "I came from Judah," or I'm from Judah, or I am a Judah. I'm trying to say it the way he would. He claims to be from Judah, but he's not claiming to be a descendant of Judah. He's claiming to be from that region where his parents or whoever may have been living in a city there at the time. Now, we'll just point out here that the Septuagint, the LXX, is the designation for the Septuagint, meaning the Greek translation of the Old Testament, if you don't know what that means. In about 300 years before Christ, it was appointed and authorized that the Jews could translate their Jewish Old Testament into the modern language of the day. And since the modern language of the day, after Alexander the Great, was Greek, they created the Septuagint version. And so it's a Greek translation of the Old Testament, 300 years or 250 years before Christ. And it, along with a lot of commentators, connect this young Levite to being a grandson of Moses. And there's a reference to Moses' son, Gershom, in chapter 18, verse 30, although he doesn't say Gershom was his father. In fact, there's a little bit of a question about Manasseh, Gershom, and stuff in there. We'll look at that in a minute. So it's possible, it's likely that he's Moses' grandson. And again, if he is, then this whole event is taking place pretty quickly, pretty soon after Joshua, the days of Joshua. Okay. And I put the map in here just again as a way of looking at it. So here, what you don't see on the map is the tribe of Levi, because Levi doesn't have a territory. But in each one of those tribal territories, the Levites were expected to establish, or were even given cities to inhabit, so that they could have, so that God could have, and the Israelite nation could have priests available to them without going to a particular location, right? They're scattered throughout the land of Israel. If you need a priest to declare you clean from leprosy, you don't have to travel all the way down from the north down into wherever in Shiloh or wherever the tabernacle is. You can have a priest that is available to you to look at your home and say, oh, the leprosy is clean, you can inhabit it again, or the other various kinds of washings and cleansings, things that you don't have to be at the tabernacle for. And so God had very intelligently and wisely spread the priesthood out throughout the whole nation. And so I just, again, pointing out Levi is not on the map, and yet they are on the map because there's 36, I think, total cities that they were granted under Joshua. Okay, so anyway, he had come from the city of Bethlehem. So Bethlehem is in Judea or Judah. But he's a sojourner. I guess he's not happy being somebody who dwells in Judah or Bethlehem anymore. So he's just wandering and looking for a place to stay, this Levite is. And so he happens upon Micah's place up there in Ephraim. Okay, and so Micah offers the Levite wages. So he sees this Levite and he's like, oh, I got a great opportunity here. I'm a man who's spiritual. I got idols in my house. I got a shrine in my house. I got an ephod in my house. Since I didn't have anybody else, I gave one of my sons the role to be the priest of my house. But, oh, look at this. A Levite just wandered onto my doorstep, and I'd like to go ahead and make sure that I can get him because I'm a spiritual guy. Yeah. Yes. Bethlehem, Ephrathah, and at Bethlehem to the north. Well, this is Bethlehem. This is Bethlehem Ephrathah, the one in Judah. The other one is outside of Judah. It's north. I think it's in. I can't remember which tribe it's in, but yeah, Bethlehem Ephrathah is the Bethlehem of Judah. Okay, so good question. Thank you for clarifying. Okay, so this Levite just happens to be wandering, looking for a place and a purpose in life, and wanders into Micah's region. And so Micah offers this Levite wages if he would stay in his house. And he says, serve as my father. I don't know what that means. Apparently his father has passed. And then later he'll refer to him as his son. And so I don't know the age difference gap of any kind between these two. But he's like, I want you to have authority in my house. And I want you to serve as a priest in my house is how I would interpret that. And so his wages would be 10 shekels of silver per year. Let's assume that that's a decent salary, given the fact that he was given a suit of clothes maybe every year, and all of the sustenance to live on. So he's given food and room and board, clothes, 10 shekels of silver for spending cash, and just hang out in my house and be my priest. Okay, is what he was offered. And the Levites believed this sounded like a pretty decent deal. Yeah. Yeah. Off the top, I didn't look at the total. I'm not sure what it is. It was, the 1,100 shekels of silver was substantial. Couple hundred shekels of silver, probably. I'd have to kind of think about it for a second. Probably at least half a year's a wage. So, I don't know. Just speaking, I can't do the calculations in my head at the moment. So it's decent. I'm going to say I don't know if it's enough to live on, but it's enough to live on when everything else, all your other expenditures are being paid for. All right. Now, there's in all of this, in this Levite coming from Judah, we don't know anything about him yet, but there's no mention when this Levite comes into the house of Micah that he went, oh, well, if you want me to be a priest, the first thing I got to do is get rid of this ephod, get rid of these carved images, get rid of this shrine. If you want me to be your priest, it's got to be done under Yahweh's instruction. Well, there's none of that. We don't see that. In fact, it seems that he immediately adopts whatever form of worship that Micah is involved in. He's willing to be a priest over that. So, again, this is early, decades after Moses and after Joshua. And so they're already completely abandoning what it means to not have idols. But nevertheless, Micah was confident. Micah is the employer here, is confident that Yahweh would show him favor because he now has a personal Levite living with him, which is to me just self-deception. I'm going to engage in all forms of things that God hates in idolatry, but I'm paying a Levite to stay with me, so surely the blessings must come to me. Now, you can see the mindset of Micah here for us in the first 13 verses or whatever. He's willing to steal, but he doesn't want to be cursed. He's willing to engage in idolatry, but he wants Yahweh's blessing. Like, he's got a mind that wants the spiritual goodness that comes, but he has no desire to be in actual submission or obedience to God himself. Okay. So that really kind of sets the stage for what's going to happen next here, and that's between Micah and the tribe of Dan. So that was a pretty short chapter, and now we're going to look at chapter 18. And all that was I think that helps, again, part of this bridge, this transition. Micah's an idolater, and Micah has a Levite living in his house. And now we're going to see the second side of that coin is that the tribe of Dan, early on in this season of time, had not really conquered their territory. And so they're on the move looking for a safe place to dwell as a tribe. And that's going to involve Micah, the Levite, and the people from Dan. So, Judges 18, verse 1. In those days, there was no king in Israel. And in those days, the tribe of the Danites was seeking an inheritance for itself to dwell in. For until that day, their inheritance among the tribes of Israel had not fallen to them, which is a fancy way of saying they didn't have enough faith to go conquer it, enough, obedience to God to go do it. So the children of Dan sent 5 men of their family from their territory, men of valor from Zorah and Eschatal, to spy out the land and search it. And they said to them, "Go and search the land." So they went to the mountains of Ephraim and to the house of Micah and lodged there. He said to them, "Thus and so Micah did for me." Am I missing? Verse 3 got popped out of here. I checked it like 4 times and it still was missing. So verse 3. So while they were at the house of Micah, they recognized the voice of the young Levite, and they turned aside and said to him, "Who brought you here, and what are you doing in this place? What do you have here?" There we go. And there we go. And he said to them, and so Micah did for me. He has hired me, and I become his priest. So they said to him, "Please inquire of God, that we may know whether the journey on which we go will be prosperous." And the priest said to them, "Go in peace. The presence of Yahweh will be with you on your way." So the 5 men departed and went to Laish, and they saw the people who were there and how they dwelt safely in the manner of the Sidonians, quiet and secure. There were no rulers in the land who might put them to shame for anything. They were far from the Sidonians, and they had no ties with anyone. Then the spies came back to their brethren at Zorah and Eshtal, and their brethren said to them, "What is your report?" So they said, "Arise, let us go up against them, for we have seen the land, and it indeed is very good. Would you do nothing? Do not hesitate to go and enter and possess the land. When you go, you will come to a secure people and a large land, for God has given it into your hands, a place where there is no lack of anything on the earth." And 600 men of the family of the Danites went from there, from Zorah to Eshtal, and armed with weapons of war. Then they went up and encamped at Kirjath-Jearim in Judah, and therefore they called the place Micah and Dan to this day. There it is, west of Kirjath-Jearim, and they passed from there to the mountains of Ephraim, and they came to the house of Micah. Then the 5 men who had gone to spy out the country of Laish answered and said to their brethren, do you know that there are in these houses an ephod, household idols, a carved image, a molded image? Now therefore consider what you should do. So they turned aside, and they came to the house of the young Levite man, to the house of Micah, and greeted him. The 600 men, armed with their weapons of war, who were of the children of Dan, stood by the entrance of the gate. Then the 5 men who had gone to spy out the land went up. Entering there, they took the carved image, the ephod, the household idols, and the molded image. And the priest stood at the entrance of the gate with 600 men who were armed with weapons of war. And when these went into Micah's house, and they took the carved image, the ephod, the household idols, and the molded image, the priest said to them, what are you doing? And they said to him, be quiet, put your hand over your mouth, and come with us. Be a father and a priest to us. Is it better for you to be the priest of the household of one man, or that you be a priest of a tribe and of a family in Israel? So the priest's heart was glad, and he took the ephod, the household idols, and the carved image, and took his place among the people. Then they turned and departed, and put the little ones, the livestock, and the goods in front of them. When they were a good way from the house of Micah, the men who were in the houses near Micah's house gathered together and overtook the children of Dan. And they called out to the children of Dan, so they turned around and said to Micah, what ails you that you have gathered at such a company? So he said, you have taken away my gods, which I have made, and the priest, and you have gone away. Now what more do I have? How can you say to me, what ails you? And the children of Dan said to him, do not let your voice be heard among us, lest angry men fall upon you and you lose your life with the lives of your household. Then the children of Dan went their way, and Micah saw that they were too strong for him, and he turned and went back to his house. So, not a whole lot of good going on there. Okay, this is, again, we got just account after account after account of people having major challenges with their moral conduct, and we see it here as well. So the narrator reminds the reader, in those days there was no king in Israel, because that's why you're seeing all this immorality and complete abandonment of a relationship to Yahweh. And this is helping to frame the events that follow. Don't expect something good to happen. There was no king in Israel, and everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. Okay, so the history that we see recorded here in chapter 17, 18 is accurate, but very little is provided by way of practical application, right? I mean, like, what do you do with all this stuff? Other than, I think we're supposed to be horrified by the depths of the sins that Israel has descended into, again, not hundreds of years after Moses, but decades after Moses. They've already gone so deep into this level of idolatry and wickedness. Also, the tribe of Dan had not fully occupied their territory by this time, further indicating that the events that took place, again, not long after Joshua's death, because they still had not settled for a place to live, sort of the unclaimed territory at that time. And again, it's because of their moral failures that they weren't taking the land in the first place. So without any tribal territory of their own, the Danites, the children of Dan, sojourned with the tribes of Benjamin and Ephraim for a season, but they had no roots of their own and obviously no inheritance to pass on to their descendants. They couldn't pass on territory in Ephraim to their descendants because it wasn't theirs to begin with. They needed their own territory. They were having challenges with the territory that got assigned to them, again, over there just above Judah, off towards the Mediterranean Sea. And so rather than trusting Yahweh to give them victory over their, conquerors and their neighbors, or enlisting even the assistance of their brethren, hey, Judah, hey, Ephraim, hey, they always get upset when you don't ask them, why don't you come and help us to take our territory? Instead, the leaders of Dan are like, we need some space, we need territory, and they take 5 men of valor, 5 men of, good strength and, military skill, and go tell them, go search out a place for us to take as our own land, because we're not going to take the ones that it was appointed to us by God through Joshua. So as the men search, they're on this journey to go find some land that the other tribes haven't occupied, and that they felt well able to go conquer. As the men searched, they came to this very place where the Levite had come, and that is to Micah's house there in Ephraim. Note that Israel had been commanded to offer hospitality to travelers who are passing through town. So I won't go there now tonight, but like in Exodus 23, Leviticus 19, there's instructions to be hospitable. You were sojourners in the land of Egypt, so since you were sojourners in Egypt, you be hospitable to people in need, especially as they're traveling through. There's not hotels. There's not, restaurants. There's not places that you can just go, well, I'll be independent and go from the north of Israel to the south, or vice versa. If you're traveling, as it turns nightfall, you're going to find a place to stay. The people of Israel were expected to host at least people of Israel who are traveling for some reason through your territory. And I think I didn't come across it. I think it was expected that 3 days you were basically morally obligated to host somebody for 3 days. But after 3 days, they were morally obligated to leave. It was kind of the way it was supposed to work. So, all right. So while these 5 men are staying with Micah, they hear the voice of the Levite, doing whatever priestly duties he's doing in the house, and that he'd been praying to his own being. Micah had been paying this man to be his personal but idolatrous priest, and so they strike up this conversation. Hey, what are you doing? You seem to be, in charge of the spiritual conduct that happens here in the house. So they begin asking him probing questions like, who brought you here? How did you become to be staying with Micah? And they wanted to know, well, what are you doing here now? What are your responsibilities? What is your role here in the house? And they asked him specifically now, there's obviously some kind of thinking going on, what are you receiving in compensation? Now that's a question that when you want to hire somebody, you ask them, how much are you getting paid over there? And you go, oh, well, I'm getting paid X. And you go, oh, I'll pay you X times 1.2 and offer you a new job. They're asking them questions because they think that he's going to be an asset to them, and so they're starting to ask him questions about what do you do here and how committed are you to being here? And I think he basically said, well, I'm getting paid, so if you pay me more, I go where the money's good. I think that's somewhat of the message that's being communicated here. So he responds to their questions, answers whatever. He doesn't tell us what he said, but he responded to their questions without any hesitation. He's not like, oh, I'm sorry, I've made a commitment to Micah. I can't answer these questions. He just tells them what they want to know, and that kind of sets the stage for what's coming later. You saw it in the later part of the chapter. So the Danites then asked the Levite to inquire of God. Now they used the generic Elohim, God here. Inquire of God, so that they would... They wanted to know, would God, or this Levite in God's name, say that they would have a prosperous journey as they traveled looking for a place for Dan to dwell. Now, immediately this Levite, again, we don't know his name, but this Levite responds, but there's no indication that he actually turned and petitioned Yahweh for anything, right? They want to know, will God bless our journey? And he goes, oh, absolutely. God's going to bless your journey. There's no indication that he actually heard from God or interceded on their behalf or did anything that you and I would think would be necessary to find out, can I actually say these words that God will prosper your journey, when he didn't know. But he told them that they would have a prosperous journey. And so the men departed, and they go further north up into Laish and spied out the people and the conditions of the region. Again, they're looking for a territory to inhabit, a territory to conquer, a territory that Dan can finally call the home territory of Dan. And the place that they found in Laish was isolated from most other neighboring populations and people. Living there in Laish seemed to be living in peace without fear of anyone attacking them. whether it would be the Sidonians. So the Sidonians might be like the next closest neighbor, and what the people, the 5 spies, if you will, from Dan look upon them and they say, look, the Sidonians are neither attacking them nor protecting them. Okay, so the tribe of Dan would not go to the region of Sidonia and say, we're going to come conquer you. They're a pretty powerful, strong military force, lots of people. We don't want to deal with Sidonians. But they come over to Laish and they go, nobody seems to be around this territory. The closest sort of neighbor is the Sidonians. The Sidonians seem not to be interested in the people of Laish. They don't want to conquer them, and I don't see any reason why we'd expect the Sidonians to protect the people of Laish if we conquer them. Right? That was their evaluation of the situation. So with this intelligence gathered, these 5 men return back to their brethren who are there, again, somewhat sojourning in Zorah and Eshtal, and provided them with a positive report concerning what they found. Look, Laish is good, right? They told them the land that lacks nothing that Dan would need. It's like kind of a land flowing with milk and honey for us here. And so the people there seem very comfortable. They feel very safe. And so they're telling them, I don't expect that the people from Laish will offer us much resistance. They're not sitting there staring at their city gates going, is anybody coming over the horizon? Is somebody coming to attack us today? They're living in peace. They're living in comfort. They're not looking for a military battle, and they're not expecting one. And so if we go in surprise, they're probably going to be an easy group of people to conquer. So upon hearing this positive report, the men of Dan, the leaders of Dan, call 600 men to go up to Laish, fully armed with weapons of war. They obviously are going to go conquer that territory. Now, in one sense, if that was the territory God had given them, this is the appropriate right conduct to engage in. But Dan was given different territory by allotment, and they were not taking that territory. They're going to find other territory up in Laish that God hadn't spoken to them at all, and they're going to go conquer it. So it's hard to say, does God want them to have this land? It's not the land he gave them, but they're going to go up and try to do it. Now, again, if they were following God, like under Joshua, they should have been conquering their enemies and purging them out of the territory, because that was God's judgment on them at the time. The people of Laish, we haven't heard about. We don't know anything about what their conduct was or what the Lord had planned for them. So as they travel north, this now contingent of 600 men, or 605 possibly, came to Micah's house, and as the spies had done before. So they're kind of traveling the same exact path. And they said, hey, we stayed here with Micah before. Let's stay here with Micah again, although we have 600 men this time. Okay, and but the original 5 spies were there, and they reported, hey, did you know that Micah's house in this whole area that he's living in is deeply engaged in idolatry? It got this ephod and idols and a shrine. And when I first read that, I'm thinking, they're mad. Why, Micah? Why do you have idols in your house? Get that stuff out of here. No. They covet what he has, and they want to steal it from him, right? So then they asked their brothers to consider what should be done. Hey, guys, he's got an idol. He's got a place of worship in his house. What should we do? And they said, let's get it. Let's go get it. Let's take it. So the 5 men, with 600 men standing at the city gate, ready to protect their 5 brothers if they needed to, the 5 men go into the house and begin the process of commandeering everything that Micah had in his house for his pagan worship and idolatry. And then we'll see that they ultimately kind of go back to their brethren at the gate and basically challenge Micah, hey, if you want it, you're going to have to go through these guys. Okay. But in a secondary account here, or just making more clarity to the account, the Levite who's in Micah's house he considered it advantageous to be offered a greater opportunity by these men. So they're there, and they're telling him, look, at first he puts up a little resistance. He says, what are you guys doing? These are my idols. This is what I use to minister to my master. And they said, well, we're taking the idols, and we'd like to bring you along with us. And so they're going to begin offering him things. It doesn't tell us an amount of money they're offering him, but they're basically saying, wouldn't it be better, wouldn't you feel greater reward and blessing in your life if rather than serving this family, you served a whole tribe in Israel, the whole tribe of Dan? And he's like, I like the sound of that. I'm leaving Micah and I'm going with you guys. So he accepts their offer. Now, so all parties involved here, again, deep spiral of wickedness. All parties are engaged in, supportive of, desiring to engage in idolatry. And all the Levite did was change his allegiance without regard to anything that had been properly appointed to him as a role of a Levite by God. He shouldn't have been in Micah's house doing what he was doing, and he doesn't need to go with the Danites and do what they want him to do. And so there's a lot of challenges going on here with every part of this account here. So again, this reminds us that God shows us, all of the human frailties and failings, doesn't try to hide it and mask it in the Bible. We go, oh yeah, those guys, big problems. Oh yeah, that choice, oh, big problems. Same kind of thing happening here in the book. Yeah, big egos. The men resume their travel, so now this 600 or 605 men are now continuing on. They're headed with a purpose to go up to Laish. But before as they're departing, Micah and part of his, neighboring families come out and pursue the Danites because, of course, they've been stolen. Somewhat of a similar event in my mind to what happened with Rachel stealing her father Laban's idols in the book of Genesis. And then, they're traveling, and so Laban was like, maybe willing to let them go until he found out his household idols have been stolen, and then he jumps on and starts pursuing them. And the same kind of thing is happening here. Micah gets home, and he's like, what happened in my house? Oh, my Levite's gone. My idols are gone. And he's like, I got to go pursue those and get those back. And when he gets there, he realizes I'm completely outnumbered. It would be the most foolish, and it would just bring my own death upon me to challenge these 600 men. So he speaks to them, tells them, you stole from me. And they say, yeah, well, what are you going to do about it? And he goes, nothing. And he goes back home. Okay. So, all right, with that little conquest under our belts, let's take a look at a fairly short account of the Danites winning the battle for their territory in Laish and then settling up there as part of their really more permanent place of residency, which is kind of terrible for them because they're going to be characterized by idolatry for most of the rest of their existence. Okay, verse 27 of chapter 18. So they took the things Micah had made, the priest who had belonged to him, and went to Laish, to the people, quiet and secure, and they struck them with the edge of the sword, and they burned their city with fire. There was no deliverer because it was far from Sidon, and they had no ties with anyone. It was in the valley that belongs to Beth Rehob, so they built the city and dwelt there. And they called the name of the city Dan after the name of Dan their father, who was born to Israel. However, the name of the city was formerly Laish. Then the children of Dan set up for themselves the carved image, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, those are the confusing points, and his sons were priests to the tribe of Dan until the day of the captivity of the land. So they set up for themselves Micah's carved image, which he made, all the time of the house that all of the time that the house of God was in Shiloh. So there's a couple more markers here of time. So it talks about the captivity, and it talks about the house of God being in Shiloh. And so this at least takes us from early after Joshua into the period of David, right? When David moves the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, from Shiloh into Jerusalem, which he later conquers. And so whoever it is that wrote the book of Judges is well aware of David and all of the events that took place up there. So it's written, at least a couple of hundred years after many of the events, if not all of the events, yeah.
So were the people of Laish also Jewish descent?
No, they'd be broadly called Canaanites, right? They're living in that Canaanite territory, but they're just kind of isolated people living in a city called Laish, and I don't know that we have a lot of history about them other than that. Okay, so it's obviously a pretty quick battle. They get conquered, and Dan moves into that territory. Okay, so as expected and already reported, the people of Laish were unsuspecting and unprepared for this Danite assault against their territory, and they very easily or very quickly lose the battle. And the men from Dan struck down the men from Laish and burned their cities down. Like they want this territory, but we don't even need your houses in your city. They burned it all down so they could start fresh and build their own city. And following this victory, the men renamed the city, as you saw, Dan, after their tribal namesake. And they also set up idols stolen from Micah as a form of worship. And as I mentioned, the tribe of Dan is essentially, in Scripture, Old and the New Testament, kind of, is essentially synonymous with idolatry from this point. But that's also where we get that phrase, and we've seen it before in several other studies, from Dan to Beersheba. Dan way up in the north, even though their allotment of territory was middle of Israel, their territory that they took by conquest was Laish. It's up in the north, and so you get this phrase from north to south, or from Dan to Beersheba, which pretty much covers the territory of Israel during these times.
Isn't also why Dan is left out of when they're naming the 12?
Yeah, in Revelation 7, yeah. Yeah. Dan was, well, now you're asking me questions again that I didn't look up specifically. We'll probably talk about that next week, because they're going to shrink dramatically in the last 2 chapters of the book. So we'll probably do a survey of that. I don't remember what the numbers were. Yeah. And that's going to come out. We'll talk about that next time, that they're going to be engaged in idolatry, and they become relatively insignificant after what happens in this chapter is coming up, and then the final epilogue in chapters 20 and 21. So, okay, so let's look at that. I know chapter 19, I think we have enough time to really cover this. So what was the purpose of what we just looked at? To tell us how Dan got into the territory that Dan occupied. Now, I guess the Holy Spirit or the chronicler could have said, by the way, the children of Dan went up to Laish and they conquered it. But no, we get the full sort of account, both in the terms of the spiritual bankruptcy of the whole nation of Israel, but certainly the tribe of Dan as they move up into that territory. So the way I see it, chapter 17 and 18 is to tell us Israel's engaged early on in wickedness, spiritual idolatry, what God calls harlotry against him. And this is how Dan ends up in the northern part of Israel. That's what the purpose of those 2 chapters are. Okay. Now, chapters 19, 20, and 21, we'll look at 19 tonight. We won't look at 20 and 21 until next week. 19 is going to tell us, set the stage in this epilogue of how did Dan shrink down to really small numbers and what happened with the tribe of Dan. So 19, 20, and 21 will tell us that story. But first we got to get, how did that all occur? What was the big setup for all of that? Chapter 19 is the big setup. In chapter 20 and 21, we'll talk about the final events of all that. So starting in chapter 19, verse 1, and it came to pass in those days, when there was no king in Israel, that there was a certain Levite. This is not the same Levite. Okay, this is a different Levite. There was a certain Levite staying in the remote mountains of Ephraim, and he took for himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. But his concubine played the harlot against him and went away from him to his father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, and they were there 4 whole months. Then her husband arose and went after her and spoke kindly to her to bring her back, having his servant and a couple of donkeys with him. So he brought him to her father's house, and when the father of the young woman saw him, he was glad to meet him. Now his father-in-law, the young woman's father, detained him, and he stayed with him for 3 days. So they ate and drank and lodged there. Then it came to pass on the 4th day that they arose early in the morning, and he stood and to depart. But the young woman's father said to his son-in-law, refresh your heart with a morsel of bread, and afterward you may go your way. So they sat down, and the two of them ate and drank together. And the young woman's father said to the man, please be content to stay all night, and let your heart be merry. And when the man stood to depart, his father-in-law urged him, so he lodged there again. Then he arose early in the morning on the 5th day to depart, but the young woman's father said, please refresh your heart. So they delayed until afternoon, and both of them ate. And when the man stood to depart, he and his concubine and his servant, his father-in-law, and the young woman's father said to him, look, the day is now drawing toward evening. Please spend the night. See, the day is coming to an end. Lodge here, that your heart may be merry. Tomorrow go home, go your way early, so that you may go home. However, the man was not willing to spend the night. So he rose and departed, and came opposite Jebus, which that is Jerusalem. And with him were the 2 saddled donkeys. His concubine were also with him. They were near Jebus that day, and the day was far spent. And the servant said to his master, come, please, let us turn aside into the city of the Jebusites and lodge in it. But his master said to him, we will not turn aside here into a city of the foreigners who are not of the children of Israel. We will go on to Gibeah. So he said to his servant, come, let us draw near to one of these places and spend the night in Gibeah or in Ramah. And they passed and went by their way, and the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. They turned aside there to go in and lodge in Gibeah. And when he went in, he sat down in the open square of the city, for no one would take them into his house to spend the night. Just then an old man came from his work in the field at evening, who was also from the mountains of Ephraim, and he was staying in Gibeah, whereas the men of the place were Benjamites. And when he raised his eyes, he saw the traveler in the open square of the city, and the old man said, where are you going, and where did you come from? He said to him, we are passing from Bethlehem in Judah, toward the remote mountains of Ephraim, and I am from there. I went to Bethlehem in Judah, and now I am going to the house of Yahweh. But there is no one who will take me into his house. Although we have both straw and fodder for our donkeys, and bread and wine for myself, for your female servant, and for your young man who is with you, and for your servant, there is no lack of anything. And the old man said, peace be with you. However, let all your needs be my responsibility, only do not spend the night in the open square. So he brought him into his house and gave fodder to the donkeys, and he washed their feet, and he ate and he drank. Okay, so now we're switching. A narrative switches to provide an account of a different Levite from Ephraim. So the first Levite was from Judah, moved to Ephraim, and then moved to Dan, right? This is a Levite from Ephraim, and he ends up marrying taking a concubine. But now here's a first note of challenges that we have to address. The priestly tribe had additional regulations for sexual purity that even the other 11 tribes didn't have. If you're going to be a priest, you needed to have, serve as a Levite. You needed to have a strong separation from sexual immorality. It was chronicled for us there in Leviticus 21. And so the Levite taking a concubine, to me, seems to be an immediate violation of what was commanded, if not everybody having a problem with that. Certainly a Levite taking a concubine seems to be a violation of the law from the book of Leviticus chapter 21. Now, the concubine herself, so he's from Ephraim. The concubine is from Bethlehem in Judah. And so he fled from her Levite husband, and she's with her husband in Ephraim. She leaves him, returns back to her father's house in Bethlehem, and when she gets home into her father's house in Bethlehem, she begins to engage in or resumes her life in a practice of being a harlot. Okay, so this is part of the whole situation that's going on here. And after 4 months, the Levite came to her father's house to reclaim her. So it took 4 months, and they realizes, my concubine is missing. I'm going to go find her. And he goes to her father's house, maybe where he knew she lived. And as we saw there, I won't repeat the whole thing over and over again, but the father obviously repeatedly tries to keep them there. I don't know if he loves his daughter so much, or if there's some blessing that he wants from a Levite living in his house, but he doesn't want the Levite and his daughter, the concubine and the harlot, to go away, so he keeps restraining them. Here, stay, no stay, no stay, no stay. Also kind of like, Laban and whatnot, trying to keep Jacob on property. But after multiple attempts, finally the Levite refused to stay any longer, even though it was late afternoon. And he's like, no, if I stay another night, you're going to do the exact same thing to me tomorrow. So I'm going to leave now, and we're going to get on the road and start heading back home. So he does that. And as the Levite and the concubine travel, they go to Jebus, which is later to become Jerusalem, not in the time of the Judges, but under David, because it wasn't under Israelite control during the time that this event takes place. So because it wasn't under Israelite control, the Levite refused to stay in the first city they came to, Jebus, and so he wants to push on. He wants to get at least to Gibeah of Benjamin and down into that area. So he wants to get down there so he can stay with what he believes to be the safer option for him to stay in. However, he gets to Gibeah, and it's, seems to be either, sunset or whatever. It's starting to turn too late to travel. He gets to Gibeah, and he obviously is seeking someone to offer him hospitality. And so he's got 2 donkeys, himself, and a servant that's with him. And they end up staying in the open square because he can't find anyone who was offering them hospitality among these Gibeah people who are Benjamites. But then, somewhat providentially perhaps, this old man from Ephraim comes to greet them. He'd been working the fields, and he was finished his day. For whatever reason, he comes into Gibeah. And so he offers them lodging. He says, look, you come to stay at my house. I'm going to, you can stay there. I'm going to wash your feet. I'm going to give you all that you and your donkeys need, all the provisions, right? This kind of a rare glimpse of what seems to be moral behavior in the book of Judges. This old man wants to take care of this Levite, and he's willing, to offer him everything. I'll wash your feet. I'll feed your donkeys. I'll give you food. Even though the Levite says, hey, I've got all the provisions we need. We don't need anything. I just would like a place to stay. But the old man knows, probably, much like Lot knew, staying in the open square in our city would be not good. Okay, and so that sets the stage for what happens next. Yeah. I do believe there are some, and you see this in the historical accounts, certainly in the book or the movie, The Ten Commandments. That's a Levite's robe, right? They might have tribal sort of distinctions. He wouldn't be wearing priestly garb, but he might be wearing something that sort of identifies him as of the priestly tribes or priestly, service, so that those in the territories would know. And I don't have enough information to know for sure, but there might have been some, obvious reason to suspect, yes, they're a Levite. He's part of the priestly tribe. Yeah. All right. So this is where we get really, 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 there's lots of things that are bad in the book of Judges. This is pretty much one of the worst. So, all right, here we go. Finishing off chapter 19, starting in verse 22. So the old man and the Levite and all that, they're lodging, and as they were enjoying themselves, suddenly certain men of the city, perverted men, surrounded the house and beat on the door. And they spoke to the master of the house, the old man, saying, bring out the man who came to your house, that we may know him carnally. Carnally is added by the English translation, so we get the message. But But the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said, "No, my brethren, I beg you, do not act so wickedly. Seeing this man has come into my house, do not commit this outrage. Look, here is my virgin daughter and the man's concubine. Let them bring them out now. Humble them and do with them as you please, but to this man do not do such a vile thing." But the men would not heed him, so the man took his concubine and brought her out to them, and they knew her and abused her all night until morning, and when the day began to break, they let her go. Then the woman came as the day was dawning and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was, till it was light. And when her master arose in the morning, he opened the doors of the house and went out, go his way, and there was his concubine, fallen at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. And he said to her, "Get up, let us be going." But there was no answer. So the man lifted her onto the donkey, and the man got up and went to his place. When he entered his house, he took a knife, lay hold of his concubine, divided her into 12 pieces, limb by limb, and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. And so it was that all who saw it said, "No such deed has been done or seen from the day that the children of Israel came up from the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, confer it, and speak up." Yeah. Heavy, ugly, nasty stuff. All right. So, the scene quickly transitions. The man is trying to be hospitable. They're enjoying the friendship and the dialogue and all that's going on there. And suddenly a mob appears at the door that should strike exactly in your mind and ears as the mob that surrounded Lot's house when the two angels came and demanded to take them. And so they came in, they demand that this man, whoever it was, who was in the open square, now in the man's house, be brought out. They want to know him carnally, right? They want to violate him. And so this is basically a mirror image of what happened with Lot, except that the angels were much better at protecting Lot and his family than what's going on here tonight with this particular event. But the old man seems to have a moral standard. He offers hospitality to this man and his entourage, and he tries to beg these men not to do this wicked thing. And that should tell all of us, kind of how immoral, male-on-male sexual relations, sodomy, was considered by the Israelites. Right? This was, do not do this wicked thing. And he's so committed to trying to prevent what he believes to be, a gross abomination, which is spoken of in Leviticus, Leviticus 18. He's trying to prevent this Levite from being sexually violated. So they offer a solution, similar to what happened in Sodom, but the old man, so Lot, tries to do that in his day, but the angels wouldn't let him. But here in this case, the old man offers his own virgin daughter and the man's concubine to satisfy the sexual urges of this mob of men standing outside his door. And so while it didn't happen in Lot's day, protected there, and apparently not even the man's virgin daughter, just the concubine was put outside the door. I'm thinking of the old cartoon. What was it? Fred Flintstone putting his dog or a dinosaur or whatever outside, right? Get out of the house. So they push the concubine out the door, close the door so that the men won't come in and do anything, and let her out. And don't check on her. Don't have any concern about her all night long. Send the concubine out. Let the men go out there and do what they're going to do. And very clearly in the text, it says the men of the city knew. We know what that means. This concubine repeatedly all night long abused her to the point where she was basically ready to die and would die as a result of whatever they were doing to her. But having done whatever they were doing and went home in their murderous and drunken perhaps state, she crawls her way, the way I see it, crawls her way back to the house where her master was staying, her husband, whatever you want to call him, and kind of reaches up, as it's turning to daybreak, and she dies on the doorstep of the house. And her Levite husband seems generally unconcerned about her welfare, until he discovered her to be dead. I don't know. I mean, we can only read between the lines and speculate a little bit here. Why does he do it? We would talk about being chivalrous or whatever, I don't want my wife, I don't want my daughter, I don't want any random woman to be abused by men. I'll go face the men before I send the woman out. That's how we would do it, I think, most of us. But, that's not what happened here. He sees her, comes out the door, sees her there, says, hey, get up, let's go. We're going home. Now, she's already been a harlot, and he wanted her back, right? I mean, she's gone 4 months to her father's house. She's engaged in harlotry. That means she's been sleeping with other men. So he wanted to take her home. So he wasn't that concerned that other men would have used her in such a way. But I'm also thinking, okay, well, all the men of the city violated her all night. Maybe that crossed the line. Maybe I don't want her anymore. He's like, get up, we're going home. And when I get home, I'll, turn you loose or whatever. I don't know what his attitude was. I just know it doesn't sound in the text with any level of compassion or concern for this woman that he went to rescue from her father's house 4 months earlier, right? Or at least to go bring her back. Yeah, he slept. Right, yeah, unconcerned, right. And so it's hard to picture where this guy is, because then what he does next sounds like he's upset, right? So he loads her corpse. I'm assuming she's 100% dead at this point. He loads her corpse on his donkey, and he continues on this journey home. Then once he gets home, he's kind of safely back in his own territory. He takes out a knife. He dismembers the body into 12 what I would call morbid sections. I don't know what it looks like, how you get 12 sections out of whatever, okay? And I don't want to know probably. And sent those pieces to each of the 12 tribes of Israel. I don't know how he did it. I don't know if there's a courier service that allows that to happen, or how he got these body parts distributed up to every tribe in Israel. But somehow he carves her up and he sends out a message of her mutilated body out into the tribes of Israel. Basically wants to communicate how outraged he is over what the men of Gibeah had done to him and to his concubine.
So are the concubines back in those days, were they used for more than just?
Yeah. Physical intimacy.
Were they also used to help with household chores and that? Because it sounds like he was okay with it until she died.
Yeah.
And then it's like, what was it taking away from him?
Yeah, I mean, a concubine would be considered kind of a second-tier wife. Sometimes they're used because the primary wife is barren, and so you have a concubine to hopefully give you offspring because your primary wife or wives weren't able to. And other times they may be like a handmaid, like somebody who serves in the house or serves the wife of the house, in some capacity. And so there might be different roles and functions. Obviously, the primary one for the man is physical connection. So, yeah. Okay. And so, unsurprisingly, even during this ungodly time in Israel's history, the behavior, they're constantly engaged in idolatry and all that. The tribes that received this message of this, partially or fully dismembered but partially sent to them, corpse of this woman's body, were mortified and claimed that never, ever in the history of this nation had the children of Israel seen or done such a thing as this. Now, whether or not that, I don't think that means a woman has never been raped in this whole situation, but never has been somebody been so outraged by the event that they've carved up the body and sent it out to try and get everybody's attention. So the leaders of at least 11 of the tribes, I don't think Benjamin was involved in this. I don't know if they got the message or what. I mean, it talks about how all of Israel was outraged by what they received. But Benjamin is going to be the center of the focus of what's going on in the next two chapters. But the rest of them, I think, come together and begin to contemplate or discuss what should be done because of what the Benjamites had done to this concubine. And what seems to be clear is that all of the 11 tribes deemed that it was necessary for the men who had committed this crime, the perpetrators, to be executed for what they had done, right? To put them to death. That's the stage that sets for the next 2 chapters. So the Levite who is outraged adds to the outrage or passes that outrage on to the other 11 tribes. And what they want is whichever men, so they want justice, and we'll see that in the next chapter, but they want justice. They want the men who did this thing to be put to death for their crime. What's going to transpire and what we'll see is that the whole tribe of Benjamin, rather than agreeing that justice needs to be served, says, let's go to war. And 11 tribes against Benjamin will go. And it may not go as exactly how you think it might go, unless you've read it recently or remember what you read last. It's a pretty ugly battle all the way through to the very end. And then we'll talk about what the wrap-up of all that is for next week. But dark period in Israel's history. Yes, sir. In many ways, yeah. Right. So, what do you take from all of this? It's, again, there's nothing instructive here as to what you should do. I mean, being hospitable like the old man who, tried to prevent all this stuff from happening. But for the most part, you see, this is what society and human beings and even people who call themselves aligned with the God who created them, without constraint, without any kind of moral moorings, we drift off into this, completely horrific way of conducting ourselves. And so there was no God. They weren't worshiping God, and there was no king in Israel to hold people accountable for their crimes, for the most part. And everyone was doing what was right in their eyes, and doing what is right in their own eyes is wicked, sinful, horrible, both to man and to God in terms of their conduct. So, but we'll wrap up again what happens next week and see. I imagine the people of Gibeah probably knew. Yeah, they probably knew. But even so, I mean, if it was, if they just wiped out the whole town of Gibeah, guilty or innocent, in terms of the individuals, it would still be a whole lot different than what the actual battle will be in the next chapter. So, all right, have a good evening. See you next week for this.
Scott?
Yep.